damage that Israel has done to its international reputation is irreversible. It's the equivalent of Sharpeville or Soweto in South Africa, or the Tet Offensive during the Vietnam War. There is no coming back from this. Israel is different than many other colonial powers because for Israel, the support of Western public opinion is not just a luxury, it's an essential strategic asset. And that no longer exists. And all these young people who were demonstrating in the streets, who were watching all these scenes and horrors, they're increasingly going to be in positions of authority and responsibility. And they will remember what they saw. Israel has become exceptionally toxic, and there's really no detoxification of what it has done. So it's much easier to become a pariah state than to stop being one.
Salamat everyone. You are listening to Red Inverted Triangle. This show is about the ongoing struggle for liberation in Palestine, produced on the unceded lands of the Gadigal people. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Like Palestine, Australia is the ground zero of a genocide that has been occurring for over 200 years and continues to this day. From the river to the sea, this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. My name is Ahmed. I am a Palestinian living on this stolen land, and I'll be your host. This podcast aims to provide the Palestinian story, Palestinian narrative. It's necessary because we live in a heavily indoctrinated society where, as Palestinians, being able to speak, to tell our stories and narrate is the ultimate form of resistance. That's right, resistance, hence the name of our show, Red Inverted Triangle. Each week, we'll be bringing you different segments, such as news updates from Palestine, Palestinian music, interviews with Palestinian figures or non-Palestinian figures talking about Palestine, and everything else related to Palestine. Thanks for tuning in, and long live the resistance. This episode of Red Inverted Triangle, we are bringing you a conversation I've had with Mouin Rabbani. Mouin is a researcher, analyst, and commentator specializing in Palestinian-Israeli affairs and the contemporary Middle East. He has, among other positions, served as Principal Political Affairs Officer with the Office of UN Special Envoy for Syria, Senior Middle East Analyst and Special Advisor on Israel-Palestine with the International Crisis Group, and researcher with Al-Haq, West Bank affiliate of the International Commission of Jurists. Rabbani is the co-editor of Jadaliyya, where he also hosts the Connections podcast, co-hosts the Long-Form Conversations podcast, and edits its Quick Thoughts feature. He is also contributing editor of Middle East Report. We spoke about the recent statements of recognition of the state of Palestine by some Western countries, including this one. We also spoke about the prospects of the recently proposed Trump peace plan in Gaza and in the Middle East. I hope you'll find my conversation with Mouin useful and productive. Enjoy. Mouin, welcome to the conversation, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much, Ahmed, and thank you for the invitation to speak with you and your viewers today.
The pleasure is absolutely ours. So we have this fragile ceasefire in place in Gaza, although it's been, violated by Israel for more than 100 times reportedly. Clearly, the situation is very volatile and dynamic to the point that whatever we discuss today might be probably obsolete in the next couple of hours or something. Some development might happen and throw the entire situation out of alignment. So just today we woke up to this news from the International Court of Justice ruling regarding the UNRWA, where, I want to read some of the excerpts from it. Amongst other things, the ICJ ruled that the Israel's obstruction of UN relief for the millions of Palestinians in Gaza is part of its crimes of weaponized starvation and forced displacement that must end immediately. Also, that Israel has no sovereignty in Gaza, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and has no right to prevent the UN from operating there. And lastly, that the UNRWA is neutral and indispensable, and Israel's claims against it are baseless. So these are really extraordinary rulings, and the language is pretty stern and straightforward. So I'm really keen to get briefly your reaction to it, as because it's pretty raw coming out of the news.
Yes. Well, it's maybe useful to take a step back and discuss how this case came about. As you know, earlier this year, Israel banned the United Nations and its various agencies from operating in the Gaza Strip. It designated UNRWA, a UN agency, as a terrorist organization. I don't think legislation to this effect has ever been passed by any other state against a UN agency, and seized some of its facilities and so on. And then Norway, I believe it was primarily Norway, or perhaps even only Norway, went to the General Assembly, which then referred the matter to the International Court of Justice. Now, it's called an advisory opinion because formally, when the General Assembly requests clarification on a point of law from the International Court of Justice, those are always called advisory opinions, but they are authoritative statements of international law. There's some discussion about the extent to which they are binding or not. But the question before the court concerned solely Israel's obligations as an occupying power with respect to the presence and activities of the United Nations and UN agencies, of international organizations, and of third-party states in the occupied territories. In other words, what obligations does Israel have towards these organizations and their ability to operate? And UNRWA, of course, formed a specific focus because it is a main agency operating in the Gaza Strip and the one that has been most in Israel's crosshairs. Now, many of the things that you just read out from the advisory opinion are in fact restatements of points that the court has made on multiple occasions before, in the 2004 wall resolution, in last year's or July's resolution declaring the occupation to be illegal, unlawful, and illegitimate. And it restated many of these points in this advisory opinion, but it focused specifically on Israel's obligations as an occupying power. And in that context, the ruling was absolutely devastating towards Israel. It basically said that Israel had failed to substantiate any of its accusations against UNRWA. It pointed out that UNRWA is the most important agency working in the occupied territories, and that Israel has absolutely no right to obstruct its activities in any way, shape, or form. It called, I believe, also for accountability for all the UNRWA staff that have been murdered during the Gaza genocide, for the destruction of UN facilities during the Gaza genocide. It basically made short shrift of the US-Israeli project known as the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which were in a sense operating as death squads rather than aid agencies. And it pointed out Israel's obligation as an occupying power. Israel itself is responsible for the welfare of those it occupies. The problem is not only is Israel shirking all its direct responsibilities, it is also making it impossible for others to carry out these activities. And, you know, from Israel's point of view, it's difficult to imagine how the ruling could have been worse. And of course, Israel's response was it categorically rejects this. The judges don't understand international law. They have no idea what they're talking about. They ignored all the most important evidence and so on. And I think it's also important in another respect. As your viewers may recall, in January of last year, January 2024, the court found South Africa's accusations against Israel regarding the Genocide Convention sufficiently plausible to move forward with a full hearing on the case. Israel, of course, roundly denounced that, played the aggrieved victim, and all the rest of it. But then the propaganda line became no one can accuse Israel of genocide unless and until the court has made a formal and definitive ruling to this effect. And absent such a ruling, you're not allowed to discuss genocide. Well, today we got an indication of how Israel would respond to such a ruling. You know, if unexpectedly the court in a few years decides that Israel is not guilty of genocide, it will be celebrated as the unassailable definitive ruling by a competent court. But if, as widely anticipated, the court does find Israel guilty, then of course it will be meaningless, anti-Semitic, blood libel, politicized. The court doesn't know what it's talking about, and so on. So I think one of the values of today's ruling is we got a very good indication of how Israel deals with rulings that it doesn't like. You know, when they're in its favor, they're professional, competent, independent, impartial opinions. When they're not in its favor, it dismisses them with all kinds of rhetoric and denunciations and condemnations.
Including the strong accusation, which is, being anti-Semitic and so on and so forth, something that we're used to,
Yes.
especially here in Australia as well. But I want to go into the question of the ceasefire. I want to get your prediction. I mean, you probably don't have this.
No, I certainly can't.
So what's your prediction? I mean, about this ceasefire. I mean, that's probably the $1 million question that everyone is asking now. Do you think it's going to last, or are we witnessing another moment similar to, March earlier this year? Because I'm asking this question because we had the pleasure of hosting Chris Hedges here in Sydney early this week, and he insists that Israel's end goal is to ethnically cleanse Gaza right from the get-go, and that's probably the opinion shared by so many scholars.
Well,
Do you think the campaign will resume to that end, or do you think that Israel's Netanyahu has given up on that end goal under pressure from Trump?
no, I don't. And I think, first of all, I think Chris Hedges is entirely correct. Second of all, I think it's important to realize there are different ways of skinning a cat, if you will. You can achieve an objective through different means. And it's useful just to recall how this agreement came about. For 2 years, Arab governments, regional governments, have been quite content to play the role of inert spectators as Israel slaughters Palestinians within their homeland. The problem is that the regionalization of this conflict, for lack of a better term, has formed a growing threat to the national security of these various states and governments. And to make a long story short, the straw that broke the camel's back, as far as they were concerned, was the Israeli bombing of the Qatari capital, Doha, because unlike Iran, Qatar is a close U.S. ally that has the largest U.S. airbase in the Middle East. It's not Hezbollah, it's not Yemen. And I think pro-Western governments in the Middle East saw this as an attack that could not have been carried out without either U.S. support or U.S. authorization, or at the very least, passive acquiescence from Washington. And so they realized that the U.S. security guarantee that they thought they enjoyed doesn't apply when it comes to being attacked by Israel. And so alarm bells went off. And Israel, which many of them had previously seen as a valued partner in security and intelligence and so on, is increasingly seen by them as the regional arsonist and pyromaniac that's being given an endless supply of fuel and matches by the United States. So at the UN General Assembly in last month, on the sidelines of that meeting, a number of Arab leaders and leaders of Muslim states met with Trump, impressed upon him the need to find a resolution to this crisis. And in subsequent negotiations, they agreed a 21-point proposal. A few days later, Netanyahu shows up in Washington. The Americans tell him, this is what's going to happen. You're going to have to agree to a deal. And Netanyahu managed to alter it in significant respects so that it ended up becoming a 20-point proposal. And interestingly, one of the clauses that was deleted from the original agreement was one in which Israel commits not to bomb Qatar again. So the thing to understand is that Israel went into this deal reluctantly, unwillingly, but was forced to do so by its sponsor in Washington. Israel was hoping that its changes to the proposal would lead Hamas to categorically reject it. But Hamas was in a very tight spot because it could neither accept a proposal that essentially called on it to commit organizational suicide and capitulate on Palestinian national rights, but it couldn't reject it either because even the amended proposal had the unified support of Arab governments and of key Muslim states like Turkey, Pakistan, and Indonesia. And rejecting it would also be seen as a betrayal of the Palestinians in Gaza, who were facing this intensifying genocide and famine conditions. And even if they were cynical about U.S. intentions, from their perspective, even a pause would have been welcome. Even a stay of execution is better than getting wiped out that same day. And the proposal had three elements. The first dealt with, let's call them immediate issues: ceasefire, exchange of captives, humanitarian aid, the extent of Israeli withdrawal in the Gaza Strip. The second dealt with post-war governance, disarmament, this obscene concept of de-radicalization. And the third, only very tangentially, dealt with a political horizon. So this was never a peace plan to begin with. It was a proposal to address the crisis. And Hamas, I think, quite intelligently responded by accepting those aspects of the proposal that dealt with immediate issues, and they were sufficiently vague that Hamas said it was prepared to enter into immediate negotiations about them, understanding that the president in the White House is a vain narcissist. They even went so far as to thank him personally for issuing this proposal, and they essentially said nothing about post-war governance, saying that, Hamas is not competent to accept or reject them because they concern issues that require a national Palestinian consensus and have to be in line with international law. Trump, who, for reasons of his own, needed a diplomatic achievement, Ukraine was turning into nothing that he could achieve. He had a domestic crisis in terms of the government shutdown, took Hamas's response as an acceptance. He even reposted their response on his social media, and to Israel's consternation, basically ordered the immediate commencement of negotiations in Egypt to agree on the first stage. And so the proposal was made on the 29th of September. An agreement between Israel and the Palestinians was reached on the 8th of October. It was a very lopsided agreement. I mean, if you look at the prisoner exchange clauses of those, Hamas released all the living captives it still held, along with a commitment to release the bodies of all the dead captives that were still in the Gaza Strip. And in exchange, would receive approximately 2 out of 8 or 9,000 prisoners being held by Israel, in addition to 250 who were serving life sentences, of which Israel in the end only released, I believe, 195. So it was, and the reason it was so lopsided was because it was not an exchange of captives in the conventional sense of the word. Hamas was basically relinquishing the captives for a suspension of the genocide. And I think in doing so, it not only really had no choice, but given the situation, it was also the right thing to do. Now, Hamas insisted that it needed guarantees that the genocide would not resume. And it received all kinds of assurances from regional parties, public statements by Trump that the war is at an end and so on. Now, I personally think you can't even trust Trump as far as you can throw him. And he's, nothing the man ever says can be considered as a commitment, let alone a meaningful one. But under the circumstances, this was taken within the region and globally as a declaration of the end, let's say, of major military operations. As you pointed out, Israeli attacks have continued. And from the Israeli perspective, a ceasefire means, you cease, but I continue to fire. Israel's approach to agreements is that first you reach an agreement, then you negotiate the implementation of that agreement, in which the agreement itself is considered fundamentally irrelevant, and you try to change the terms of the agreement in negotiating the implementation. And then and then there's the implementation of the agreement, where Israel views the obligations that it has accepted not as commitments, but as preferences that it is free to violate. And that's why we have seen the current situation. Now, the question you ask is what's next? As that's informed speculation is even stretching it a bit. There's several possibilities. Some people predicted that as soon as Israel retrieved its captives, it would act like nothing had happened and resume the genocidal military campaign in full force. Others believe that Israel is waiting to sabotage and cause the collapse of negotiations about post-war governance, because the Palestinians, of course, can't accept a so-called international stabilization force that is there as an Israeli surrogate rather than to serve Palestinian interests, and nor can they accept Tony Blair being put forward as a kind of colonial viceroy over the Gaza Strip. So Israel can use the inability to reach an agreement on these issues to collapse the agreement and then resume its campaign in full force. There's also, I think, another possibility that if no agreement is reached, that this will serve Israeli interests, because it can then use the absence of an agreement as a pretext to block reconstruction, to block humanitarian aid even further. And it's important to add that Israel so far has not been fulfilling its commitments under the 8 October agreement regarding the entry of humanitarian goods, and all with the purpose of ethnically cleansing the Gaza Strip. Now, if you want to ethnically cleanse a territory, you can do it in two ways. One is, let's say, the Nakba model, where in a short period of time, you forcibly expel as many of the residents of a particular territory as possible. That's not really on the agenda anymore because of the strenuous opposition of the Arab states, who, for reasons I won't get into now, refuse to be complicit in this. Another one is, if you can't have a flood, you settle for a trickle. You create circumstances in the Gaza Strip that, let's compare them, let's say, to Syria a decade ago. There was no government decision to forcibly expel the Syrian population from the territories where so many of them left, but living conditions were sufficiently disastrous, were sufficiently dangerous, were sufficiently violent, that people, in order to survive, or in order to secure a better future for their children, in order to avoid the catastrophe they were living in, began to leave in growing numbers, and not part of necessarily an organized government policy or campaign. Now, if Israel has to wait 3 or 5 years to achieve what it can't achieve in the space of several months, I think that would suit Israel just fine. Whether it happens or not, of course, is another issue, because the Syrians who left Syria knew that they could always come back, and they knew that at most they would have to wait for regime change in Syria and they could return. There wasn't legislation or an army waiting at the border to shoot them on sight the minute they cross the border. Palestinians, of course, understand that if and when they leave, it's a one-way ticket, and Israel will do everything within its power to ensure they never return, and that may make them more reluctant to leave.
So, from what I gather from what you just described, can we consider Trump's plan as a conversation starter, or do we fear, going back to a structure similar to what was imposed in Oslo Accords in
Well,
19?
that's I think a very good point because one of the purposes of this proposal is really to ensnare the Palestinians into an Oslo-like process, of interminable negotiations about completely trivial matters that in the end change absolutely nothing on the ground. And I think this is very much the U.S.-Israeli intention to kind of entrap the Palestinians into such a negotiations framework. Now, the difference, and it will have a much lower political ceiling, of course, than Oslo, because the 20-point proposal doesn't recognize any Palestinian rights. It simply notes for the record that Palestinians aspire to self-determination and statehood. Well, a lot of people aspire to a lot of things. That doesn't make them rights. So that's the first thing. But the second difference with Oslo is that you now have an alternative dynamic, which I think is best represented by what is known as the Hague Group, a collection of governments that are seeking to replace impunity with accountability, that are seeking to ensure that any political process has Palestinian rights and the achievement of those rights at its very foundation, and that Palestinians, if they get their act together, can actually use to kind of leapfrog this Oslo-like process and ensure that there is a process that guarantees and that promotes their rights. It's easier said than done, of course, but you do now have a very different global environment that Palestinians would be able to use to their advantage.
Absolutely. I want to circle back to the Palestinian situation right now and, the future of the Palestinian resistance in response to this Trump's plan. We saw some of the points, asking or forcing or trying to force Hamas to disarm. We're trying to see Hamas being excluded from any future polity in Palestine, in a future Palestine. It's pretty much trying to weed out any concept of resistance moving forward when it comes to Palestinian political structure in the
That's
future.
certainly the intention, yes.
Yeah. So how do we respond to that? Where do you see the future of the Palestinian resistance? Do you see it taking a different shape and pattern? Diplomatic resistance, and you mentioned the Hague Group.
Well, I think what we should focus on is a Palestinian national movement as a whole, which is fractured, fragmented, has been experiencing a very serious schism since 2006, 2007. And I think the key challenge for the Palestinians is to overcome this fragmentation, to revive and to rejuvenate their national movement. Because one thing we've learned in the past 2 years is that Palestinians cannot succeed if key decisions about war and peace, about the future, about solutions are taken by one faction rather than by the consensus of the national movement as a whole. I think the key obstacle to the revival of the Palestinian national movement has always been and remains Mahmoud Abbas, because we've had multiple agreements during the past decade where Hamas and Fatah have agreed on a program for reconciliation, but these have been consistently sabotaged by Abbas. So I don't think we can really have a solution so long as he remains on the scene. Once he's out, then you can see the possibility of Palestinians rebuilding their national movement on an inclusive basis. Now, everyone will say, oh, but you have to exclude this, you can't have those, you must have this. Just ignore it. Palestinian decisions about Palestine, decisions about the Palestinian national movement need to be made by Palestinians, not by Israelis, not by Americans, and certainly not by the irrelevant Europeans. And if Palestinians decide to forge a unified national movement, people will deal with it as such. Once that collective leadership, if you will, or cooperative framework is established, then you need to have the discussion and debate about strategy, about tactics, about strategic objectives, so that whatever is decided represents all the main components of the national movement, rather than to have different elements of it working in fundamentally incompatible ways and at cross purposes. Again, this may sound idealistic, and it's certainly easier said than done, but at present, there is no other option.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I want to circle back to something that also on everybody's mind is, the recent recognition of the state of Palestine by some Western countries, including this one. Some dismiss this as, meaningless, insignificant, but something you've written at Dawn platform. I want to read that excerpt from there because I would like you to could just shine some light on that. What did you mean by? So I'm quoting you here. The fact that two permanent members of the UN Security Council, G7 members, and several additional members of the NATO now recognize Palestine is not insignificant. So what did you mean by that?
Well, it's certainly not insignificant when you have permanent members of the Security Council, members of NATO, members of the G7 recognize Palestine. But it could just be a symbolic gesture. And I think we have to understand that the importance of these acts of recognition lies not in the act of recognition itself, but in the way it came about. I mean, in Australia, you've had these massive pro-Palestinian demonstrations. You've certainly had the same in all the other countries that I just mentioned. And for the very first time since the late 19th century, with the emergence of the Zionist movement, you now have Western governments taking decisions in support of the Palestinian people, not in order to improve relations with Arab governments, not out of exasperation with Israeli policy, but in response to demands of their own public opinion, of their own voters. And that, I think, put the fear of God into the Israelis, not because they recognized Palestine, but because responsiveness of governments is now for Palestinian rights rather than giving Israel additional goodies. And so it could be a precedent if the campaign that led to these governments recognizing Palestine as, let's say, a diversion and deflection from taking actual, meaningful, concrete policy decisions of holding Israel accountable for its crimes, of banning the import of settlement products, of an arms embargo, of trade sanctions. If it is meant as a diversion to that, it also means that continued and amplified public pressure can compel governments to do more. And that's what Israel that's what has Israel so worried. Are these what are these governments going to do next? Are they going to keep caving in to popular demands to change their policy? Because if they do, it's going to be a real problem for Israel.
Well, thank you for that glimpse of hope that we're actually making some difference, rallying and
Very much
educating the
so.
public. Yes, yeah, absolutely.
And if
Um,
I can, you
please.
know, um, there's no instant gratification in these things, unfortunately. We've already lost something like at least 70,000 Palestinian lives, the overwhelming majority of them civilians. The West Bank has been absolutely ravaged now for the past 2 years, and things are getting worse. Um, Things change slowly things change very slowly, but at a certain point, they begin to change much more rapidly. I mean, 3 years ago, who would have thought that you would have had Britain, France, Canada, Australia, and these other countries all recognizing the state of Palestine? It's important to recognize that until, the state of Palestine was proclaimed in 1988, and most of the international community recognized that state either in the late 1980s or early 90s, decades ago. Until last year, the only Western state that had recognized Palestine was Sweden in 2014. In other words, almost 2 decades after the state was proclaimed. You look at the map now, you have Norway, Belgium, Ireland, Spain, I believe Portugal did as well, Slovenia, Canada, Australia, and it's growing. That is important. That is not just symbolic politics, but more importantly, that can be made meaningful if it is augmented and amplified with not just declarations, but concrete policy changes.
Absolutely. I want to go to the title of today's session. Yeah, it's pretty provocative. The tightening diplomatic siege on Israel. It's actually inspired by an op-ed written by Carolina Landsman and the Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper. And I couldn't but mention it here. I'm going to quote her. It says, in its vengeful, that's the title, in its vengeful war in Gaza, Israel played the tragic role Hamas had scripted. And part of the article, it says, the Sparta speech, Netanyahu gave that Sparta speech a few weeks back, was effectively a recognition of defeat. It wasn't more brattle about total victory, but an admission that Israel is under diplomatic siege. For Netanyahu, the penny has dropped. Former Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar checkmated him. So it's quite a provocative article. I really encourage everyone to look it up. So I want to get your reaction to that. And on top of that, my question is, can Israel really continue to maintain its hegemony in the Middle East in the face of this widening global isolation and global awareness as well that you just mentioned?
Well, there are two dynamics working here in Israel's disfavor. In its favor, of course, it is now the regional hegemon. It has managed to successfully attack every one of its enemies and adversaries, and in some cases, they're no longer here, like the Assad regime in Syria. But Hezbollah has not been destroyed. Iran has not been destroyed. The Houthis certainly have not been destroyed. Hamas has been very significantly weakened, but is still there. And Israel's problem is now that it has this compulsive addiction to war and to expanding war. And the problem for Israel is, as Israeli propagandists always like to point out, oh, look at how small it is on the map. Yes, it is a small country with a comparatively small population that is utterly dependent, not only for its wars, but for its very survival on this constant stream of assistance and supplies from its sponsors and allies in the West. It doesn't have a limitless supply of soldiers. Its economy has done surprisingly well during the past 2 years, but the costs are piling up, and there's a growing debate about the long-term impact of its policy choices. But the point I'm trying to make is that permanent war is unsustainable for any society, but even more so for small ones like Israel. But Israel has determined that every political challenge has a military solution, and every military solution that fails requires even more force in order to meet that challenge. So it's painted itself into a corner, if you will. Secondly, I think that the damage that Israel has done to its international reputation is irreversible. It's the equivalent of Sharpeville or Soweto in South Africa, or the Tet Offensive during the Vietnam War. There is no coming back from this. Israel is different than many other colonial powers, because for Israel, the support of Western public opinion is not just a luxury, it's an essential strategic asset. And that no longer exists. And all these young people who were demonstrating in the streets, who were watching all these scenes and horrors, um, they're increasingly going to be in positions of authority and responsibility. And they will remember what they saw. Of course, you will have those who make compromises and so on. But Israel has become exceptionally toxic, and there's really no detoxification of what it has done. So broadly speaking, yes, I agree. It's much easier to become a pariah state than to stop being one.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, those 300,000 people who march across the bridge, although the authorities are trying to reduce the number, saying, oh, there are 80 or 90,000.
Well, even that.
Exactly, yeah. And even that is significant enough. I mean, probably I would go on the limb and say 60% of them didn't actually know what the situation was before October the 7th,
Yeah,
2023 in
yeah.
Palestine. So it's tremendous. Who is the ideal candidate to take the leadership in Palestine, especially now that Marwan Barghouti is still in jail and Israel refuses to let him out? So who do you think would be the most suitable leader?
Well, I don't think there is an obvious candidate for the succession. I mean, Arafat had appointed Abbas as his successor under tremendous regional and international pressure, and the various power centers that existed at the time united around Abbas because they considered him too weak to challenge them, and he's turned out to be much more authoritarian and dictatorial than Arafat ever was. People have looked to Marwan Barghouti as someone who could potentially play a unifying national leadership role, and arguably he could even play that role while in prison. But my suspicion is that after Abbas departs or is removed from the scene, you will have a concerted campaign by Israel to ensure that no single Palestinian national leader emerges to succeed him. And I think Palestinians would be well served by forming a kind of transitional leadership committee to ensure that all the various streams in Palestinian politics are represented in decision making before turning to things like elections or selection of a new leader. What the Palestinians desperately need now is not elections, but pluralism.
Now, the question that is also recurring is two-state solution still viable?
Yeah, I think if you look at it in those terms, yes, it is viable. Yes, you can force Israel to relinquish the territories it occupied in 1967 and to redeploy behind the Green Line and establish a genuinely independent and sovereign Palestinian state. I've I'm not one of those who has ever believed there's such a thing as a point of no return, that you can have kind of a mathematical equation of if you have X settlements and Y settlers, you can no longer establish a Palestinian state. Sure, it can become much more difficult. And certainly for those Western states that keep trumpeting a two-state settlement, it's basically a meaningless slogan. They have absolutely no intention of doing anything to bring it about or to bring an end to the occupation. They just keep repeating the slogan. And I should add, I'm someone who, for a variety of reasons, actually supported a two-state settlement. But I think we need to ask an additional question, which is not only can there be a two-state settlement, but should there be a two-state settlement? In other words, when you're dealing with a genocidal apartheid regime, should you make peace with it, even if you can? And to me, the answer has become a clear no.
That's a big statement to make. I always argue as long as there's this Zionist ideology that really drives this regime, there can never be one, two, three, or four state solution. Generally, if I could squeeze two more questions into the conversation, would be fantastic. One question is about the global South and its impact. Can you reflect on their capacity to pressure the global North to direct Israel to end its genocide and occupation and,
Well, the global South is a very diverse group of nations. It's not like a NATO or a European Union. It brings together a diverse group of nations with diverse interests and diverse alliances and so on. But and unlike, let's say, the states of the global North, their their leverage over Israel and over those arming and supplying Israel is limited. But I do think that in the past 2 years, we have seen the very important role that they have played. I mean, has South Africa's application to the International Court of Justice, pursuant to Israel's violations of the Genocide Convention, changed anything on the ground? Did it stop the genocide? Of course not. But these demonstrations you were just talking about and others around the world, I think could not have taken place in the form and with the size they did if Israel hadn't very clearly been seen as a state that is at least plausibly accused of committing genocide. The public perception, long-standing public perception, that Israel exists as reparations for genocide has been replaced by public perception of Israel as a genocidal state. That the key actor in that was South Africa. You've had Colombia, Brazil, and others severing diplomatic relations, severing economic relations with Israel. These are important measures. These are pioneering measures that unfortunately have not changed things on the ground, but in the larger scheme of things, I think will be looked back upon as important developments contributing to key turning points.
But if you don't mind me have a follow-up question. You
Please.
mentioned Colombia and its intervention recently about the Uniting for Peace mechanism. Could you just elaborate a little bit about this mechanism and the prospects of it working actually?
Mm. Yeah, I'm going to take a pass on that because I've heard contradictory explanations about the details. I mean, the suggestion is that if the United Nations General Assembly adopts a resolution to send essentially an interventionary force or peacekeeping forces to the Gaza Strip, then it can do so without the approval of the Security Council, where something like this would never get through because of the U.S. veto. But my understanding is that such a resolution would need the support of, I believe, at least two-thirds of the members of the General Assembly. And that's very unlikely to happen. And so while I certainly have nothing against this Colombian initiative, my own view is that perhaps a more effective way of going about this, a more constructive way of going about this, would be to form, let's call them coalitions of the willing, rather than going through institutions that have a decades-long record of failure. And I think the Hague Group is one good example of this. And I think the genocide case, where South Africa has been joined by a growing number of other governments, is another example.
My last question, and I'm conscious with time. How do you see the American-Israeli timeline for an attack on Iran and the resumption of a total bombing of Gaza as playing out?
Well, on Iran, the suggestion has been that Israel is keen to have a second round, if you will, and that for Israel, the deadline is the end of 2025, because once the new year starts, the US midterm election cycle begins, and it will be more difficult for Israel to do so. I generally agree with that. I mean, I certainly believe that Israel is very keen to have a further attack on Iran, and it probably makes sense that Israel would be best placed to do so before the end of the year. But having said that, I don't think there's anything to stop it from doing so in 2026 either. Ultimately, this is a decision that will be taken not by Israel, but by the United States. And if things are looking particularly bad for the Republicans in terms of their electoral outlook, will they then seek to bolster their popularity with an attack on Iran, or will they make sure that there isn't one because they see the growing tide of opposition to Israel from even within the MAGA constituency? So that's a difficult question to answer. With respect to Gaza, I laid out various scenarios previously. My own sense is that the most likely scenario we're going to see is that Israel will start dealing with Gaza akin to the way it has been dealing with Lebanon. It occupies parts of it, and whenever it needs to wreak sufficient havoc or throw the Gaza Strip off balance or whatever, it will launch bombing raids without necessarily once again engaging in a full-scale military campaign. But that's no more than informed speculation, and it could be very wrong.
I sure hope you're wrong. It doesn't feel like it feels like a gloomy prospect of things. And for the question of Iran, I think we're going to have a conversation with Trita Parsi next month, because he believes
he's the one who has been suggesting that for Israel the deadline is December.
Yeah, he believes that. I mean, the strike is coming, so it's interesting to see what he thinks about this. Mouin, thank you very, very much for really your time and the really enjoyable conversation. It's been an absolute honor and pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure was all mine.
Take care. You've been listening to The Palestinian Show, Red Inverted Triangle. If you'd like to learn more about Palestine, or if you'd like to get involved in the Palestine Solidarity Movement, please follow Palestine Justice Movement Sydney on Instagram or Facebook. And keep tuning in to Red Inverted Triangle. My name is Ahmed. I will see you next time.